Hello, and welcome back to another lecture series dealing with Chapter 9. And Chapter 9 talks about flex budgets and the performance analysis. So this chapter is actually pretty fun. Um, it's not as great as CVP analysis, but kind of gets close to it. Also, too, welcome back. Last week was spring break. That's why we didn't have anything posted, and wanted to, give you guys an opportunity to, kind of take a breather as much as you can as a master student. Um, but nonetheless, hopefully, you guys had a relaxing week. So, what I want to do is run through the PowerPoints and talk about some of the important things that are in here. If you noticed your study guide, there are 4 problems that we're going to work on, and it's actually putting together this flexible budget. So in the lecture portion, we'll just talk about some of those things. I'll point out uh, some tidbits that are pretty important that we'll need to know in order to put together these budgets. So we're kind of getting away from the costing aspect. The first half of the course, really, we looked at all those different costing techniques that we could use, right? Activity-based costing, variable costing, absorption costing, and then the week before last, because last week was spring break, we got into budgets, right? We put together the master budget. So now we're going to look at flexible budgets and performance analysis. And this chapter, I think, will really help you guys out, especially in your careers and in the real world, because we're dealing with analysis, right? We have some data, we got to look at it, and we got to make a decision. So hopefully this will give you some added practice dealing with analysis, or sharpen your skills. So let's jump right in and let's look at variance analysis and kind of look at this cycle, right? So we know the whole idea of accounting really is basically to record transactions, put reports out for managers to make decisions, right? Then we got into managerial accounting, which, we're still reporting, we're still making decisions, but we're not hamstringed by GAAP, right? We can do whatever we want to do, whatever information that we think is important in order to make a decision. We can categorize that information and, make decisions based on that. So when we get into variance analysis, basically, we start with a reporting period, right? We have performance reports. How well did we do? Did we manage it? Did we manage our expenses like we had planned? Did we raise enough revenue, or did we hit our sales targets? So when we're looking at the variance analysis, we start off with preparing those performance reports, right? And that sounds kind of vague. What the hell's a performance report, right? Well, our income statements, our financial statements, those can be performance reports, right? Those tell us how well we did, right? Did we make revenue, or did we make our sales? Did we have any net income? Did we have a net loss? So that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about performance reports here, right? So the first thing we need to do once we get those reports is we need to analyze the variance, right? Meaning, what's the difference? Okay, we're going to see when we dive a little deeper into this chapter, we're going to talk about the planning budget and the flex budget and how those two differ. But right now, we're from a high level view, we're talking about, okay, here's what we said we had planned on doing, like the master budget. What did we actually do? What does our income statement actually look like? And we compare the two, right? And we say, is there any variance? Did we increase? Do we have a favorable variance? Or did we decrease? Do we have an unfavorable variance, depending on if we're looking at revenues and expenses? And that's what we do after we conduct that variance or analyze those variances. We ask questions, right? Why were our salaries expense higher than what we planned, right? So we start asking questions based on those variances. And then what we need to do is we need to identify, hopefully, what caused that variance. Well, the reason why our salaries expense is so much higher than what we had planned is because we had workers that weren't very skilled, right? We had a lot of mess ups. We had to fix a lot of things, so we had to burn a lot of labor hours, okay, which is going to drive up our cost. Okay, so we identified the root cause. Next step is we got to take action, right? What do? Maybe we retrain these people. Maybe we fire them and start over again. That could be an option. Once we take action, we go ahead and we conduct the next period's operations. Then the process starts all over again, right? Prepare the reports. Let's analyze the variances. Let's raise questions. Let's identify root causes. Let's take action, and then we'll start the period all over again. So it's a very cyclical process, as you can see here, okay? So what we're going to get into now is we're going to look at the planning budget as well as the flex budget. And we'll talk about the differences between the two and how we use these to gauge our performance, okay? So the first thing we got to look at is the planning budgets, right? We did planning budgets when we did our the master budgets, right? Those were our planning budgets, right? Here's the planned level of activity. We think we're going to have our sales are going to be, $1,000 in January, $2,000 in February, and $3,000 in March. Okay, so we're going to plan we're going to prepare a budget based on that planned level. Okay, now it's very, very difficult for us to compare actual results with the planned results. Think about it this way, and I hate using this analogy. I really do hate it, but it's such a cliche, but here it comes. When we are comparing actual results to the planning budget, we are not comparing apples to apples. We're comparing apples to oranges. They're two totally different things. Why? The reason why they're two totally different things is because the planning budget is based on a static number, right? $1,000 in sales, okay? Well, what if we actually sold $1,500 worth of product? Well, of course, our actual numbers are going to be a lot higher than our planning numbers, right? All our expenses are going to be actually higher than what we planned. And the reason why is because that driver, which was production, increased, okay? So let's look at an example here of how do we compare apples to apples. It's very easy to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at Larry's lawn service, right? And we have to help Larry control his costs, okay? So let's look at an example of what Larry does. So they tell us that Larry's Lawn Service provides lawn care in a planned community. Okay, I don't know what a planned community is. I guess it's cookie cutter housing. Everybody has the same yard, same size yards, white picket fence. I'm assuming. I don't know. Anyways, they tell us that all lawns are approximately the same size. And at the end of May, Larry prepared his June budget based on mowing 500 lawns. So right off the bat, his planning budget says, if I mow 500 lawns, my revenue should be X, and all my expenses should be Y, okay? Because all the lawns are of similar size, Larry thought that the number of lawns mowed in a month would be the best way to measure overall activity in the business, Okay, that makes sense, I think. If all the lawns are of similar size, the similar you're going to have pretty much the same inputs into each lawn if they're the same size, right? It's not like we're cutting, 5 acres out in the country versus, you know, um, a little square foot of land in the city, right? So let's look at his numbers here. Now, here's the planning budget. Notice what we have in the middle here, the cost formula or the revenue formula. That's very, very important. Because what Larry already did was he did a little CVP analysis in a sense, right? He broke everything down into some of these expenses are going to be variable, right? And remember the definition for variable. Variable expenses say that in total, variable expenses change in direct proportion to changes in levels of activity. Okay. Fixed costs remain the same as long as we're in the relevant range, right? So he gave us a cost formula. Notice the revenue, 75Q. What in the world does that mean? Well, that means that Larry is going to charge $75 per lawn. Okay, so what's his total revenue? Well, 75 times Q. Q is nothing more than the quantity or the number of lawns mowed. Okay, so we see here that the number of lawns mowed, 500. So we took 75 times Q, or 75 times 500, gave us revenue of 37,500. And he did the same thing with all the expenses. He broke them down. Wages and salaries. Well, that's a mixed cost, right? Some of it's fixed, some of it's variable. So he broke it down on a monthly basis and said, okay, my salaries and wages expense. It has a fixed portion of $5,000 per month. Maybe that's Larry's salary. I don't know. Or maybe Larry has a manager and that's the manager's salary. Okay. Plus $30 times Q. Okay. So let's assume that $30 per lawn is what Larry pays his employees. Okay. Hey, you come work for me, I'm gonna pay you $30 per lawn you cut. Okay, great. The more lawns I cut, the more money I get paid. So that's why we see that 30Q. Basically, we're saying $30 times the number of lawns cut. Gas and supplies is the same thing. We spend $9 in gas and supplies per lawn. Okay, same thing with equipment maintenance, right? We broke that down and said, after we cut so many lawns, we got to sharpen the blades, we got to maybe change the oil, do all that stuff. So there's some equipment maintenance that we have to do. It averages out to about $3 per lawn. Okay, 3Q, right? Or 3 times Q. 3 times 500 gives us $1,500 in expense. So you notice revenue is $37,500, total expenses is $32,500. Larry cuts 500 yards. He's expecting to make net income of $5,000. Okay, that looks good. But now we get to the actual results, right? The actual results. Larry actually cut 550 lawns. So obviously his revenue is going to be higher. His wages and salaries are going to be higher. His gas and supplies are going to be higher. His equipment and maintenance are going to be higher. Now, you might ask me, excuse me, how do I know this, right? How do I know it's higher or lower? I'm assuming, right? Because it makes sense that the more he cuts, or the more lawns he cuts, the higher his expenses are going to be, okay? So we have the static plan versus these actual results. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a variance, okay? And what we're doing is we're comparing actual results with that static budget, okay? So when we're looking at this activity variance here, right? It's not looking too good, because if you look on the far right under variance, we have, a favorable revenue, we have unfavorable wages, unfavorable gas and supplies. Somehow we have favorable equipment maintenance and favorable office and shop utilities. Notice the fixed expenses, the rent and the equipment depreciation, those are all, there's no variance there. But for some reason, we have a variance in one of the fixed expenses, insurance. So the key takeaway here is first knowing what are we doing, right? We're taking the actual results and comparing them to the planning budget. Right off the bat, we're comparing apples and oranges, right? So to figure out or to calculate variance, what do we use? To figure out variance, we take the actual results and compare them against the static planning budget, okay? To get our numbers, we have to use our cost formulas. You will never have to create a cost formula. Let me rephrase that. In class, you will never have to create a cost formula, okay? In the real world, you will, right? You'll have to figure out, okay, what is my salaries per lawn, right? Or, what are my wages per lawn? Same thing with gas and supplies. How much gas and supplies am I using per lawn? Okay, so in the real world, you will have to kind of tinker around and figure out what your cost formulas are. In class, we're going to give those to you. Okay. So if we notice, we go through, we get favorable and unfavorable, right? What's the difference? Favorable says when the actual revenue is greater than the budgeted revenue, we have a favorable variance. Just the opposite is true if we had an unfavorable variance, right? When the actual revenue is less than the budgeted revenue, okay? Let's look at our expenses. Notice we have, looks like we got 4 expenses that are unfavorable. Why are they unfavorable? Well, let's pump the brakes here for a second. Before we say why are they unfavorable, what does unfavorable variance mean? Well, it means that the actual costs are greater than the budgeted costs, okay? If we have a favorable variance for our expenses, that means that the actual costs were less than the budgeted costs, okay? So let's look at some of the variances, right? By looking at this, we see we can right off the bat make a snap judgment and say, hey, you know what? Larry didn't do too good of a job controlling his expenses, right? Meaning his, what was the first one? The salaries and wages and salaries and wage. Let me go back here. I'm sorry. The top 2 were wages and salaries and gas and supplies. That's these 3,500 and 600, right? Larry did a bad job, right? So you're reviewing Larry's performance. You slap him on the back of the hand and say you did a poor job controlling these costs. Well, you can go ahead and do that. But Larry's smart, and Larry took this course. And Larry says, hey, you can't punish me for that. Of course, my wages and salaries and gasoline and supplies expenses are going to be higher. They are mixed and variable costs. My actual driver, which is the lawns, the actual number of lawns that I cut was higher than what you planned. So of course they're going to be higher, right? Okay, well, let's look at the favorable ones. The $200 and the $50 ones, that's the equipment maintenance and office and shop utilities. Since these variants are favorable, we say, hey, Larry, you did a good job. Well, Larry knows a backhanded comment when he hears one, and Larry took this class and he knows, they really can't say that. They can't say I did a good job because they're comparing apples and oranges. The actual results are different than what we planned for, okay? So just keep that in mind. So right now, we can't answer, just like we previously mentioned, we cannot answer any of those questions because the activity level is greater than the planned level. And when that happens, the variable costs are usually going to be higher than what we planned. So we cannot say for sure that Larry did a good job managing the costs, okay? So what we really need to ask is, what should the costs have been due to that activity, right? So in order to ask, okay, with this higher activity, how much should the cost be, right? And based on that activity, we can then say, Larry, you did a good job or you did a bad job controlling costs, okay? So in order to do that, we got to do the flex budget, okay? We got to do the flex planning budget. And the flex planning budget's pretty easy, right? You'll see, because we compare what the cost should be based on the actual level or the actual output, okay? So we got to remember our definitions of cost behavior, right? Variable costs change in direct proportion to changes in levels of activity. Total fixed costs remain unchanged as long as we're within that relevant range, okay? That kind of came back to haunt us, huh? Okay, so knowing that, we can prepare a flex budget for Larry's lawn service, but we're not going to do that in this video. We're going to come back in the next video, or our second video, and we're going to look at how do we prepare that flex budget, okay? So real quick, kind of some important takeaways here of what you should know, right? So we have the planning budget. That's static numbers, right? It's based on some predetermined planned level of activity. Here's what we assume, here's what we think we're going to do, here's what we assume we're going to do, okay? Remember, when we look at the planning budget and compare it to actual performance, we're comparing apples and oranges, right? And we cannot get a good gauge on how well costs were managed, okay? Remember, the planning budget, we have those cost and revenue formulas, and we just plug and chug based on the quantity. We take our actual results and we put them next to each other, okay? So if we're trying to calculate variance, how do we calculate variance? Actual results versus the planning budget. That's variance, okay? Because hopefully by now you've read the chapter, you know that there's spending variance coming down the pike, revenue variance coming down the pike, right? So we have this activity variance that we're talking about here. So when we're looking at activity variance, actual results versus planning budget. I'd probably jot that down if I were you, okay? We know that when the actual level of activity is greater than the planned level of activity, we can't answer any questions on how well a manager did in managing those costs, okay? So when we come back, we'll look at a flex budget.